I'm Marc Dresner, and welcome to Partnerships TV, featuring the leaders and experts at the forefront of clinical research, trials, and development today. Joining me today is James Garner. He is the Vice President and General Manager of Takeda's Global Research and Development Center in Asia. It seems that everyone these days is looking to the East in the pharmaceutical industry, but when people talk about Asia, they tend to focus on China and India for obvious reasons. Can you take us on a quick tour, if you would, of the continent from a clinical perspective?
Well, Mark, I think the key feature of our region is really its sheer diversity. Within Asia, we have countries at one end of the spectrum, like India, for example, population of more than 1 billion people, 70% of them in rural areas, over 200 indigenous languages. At the other end of the spectrum, we have countries like Singapore, where I have the pleasure of living, which is a country of just 5 million people, an area about the size of Chicago, but a higher life expectancy at birth, a higher adult literacy rate, and a higher GDP per capita than the United States. And in between, we have just about every permutation of culture, of biology, and of medical practice. From a clinical research point of view, we have countries like Hong Kong or Korea, where there's a great number of really world-leading thought leaders with a lot of experience in GCP clinical trials, in tremendously well-equipped centers. But then we also have countries like Indonesia or Thailand or even Sri Lanka these days, where the level of experience is less, the infrastructure is sometimes a little more limited, but the opportunities are nonetheless. So I think you could truly say that although China and India are a critical part of any company's Asia strategy, it's a larger and more complex region than those two countries.
A lot of particularities. Generally speaking, can you compare and contrast Asia? You know, now that we've established that Asia is anything but homogenous, let's look at it as if it were. Can you compare and contrast that with the West? What should companies consider?
Yeah, no, Mark, I think there are certain universal constants in clinical research. So things like the ethical protection of trial subjects, the scientific integrity of clinical data, the need for systematic assurance of quality through things like ICH GCP. These sort of things are common everywhere, and I think Asia has really proven by now that it can deliver on those kind of commitments. So I think we can really reject any notion that Asia is less in terms of its fundamental capabilities. I think what differs is really something like the journey rather than the end point. It's some of the ways in which Asia can participate in clinical trials. And some of those differences are just practical and logistic matters. So, for example, the Philippines is a country of 7,000 islands, and many of our trial subjects have to travel a day or more to get to the trial site. So if our study requires them to make weekly visits for 2 years, that can be quite onerous. Sometimes the differences can be more cultural in nature. So, for example, if we have a study that requires subjects to take a tablet 3 times a day with food, that can be a little bit more complex in, say, a Muslim country such as Malaysia or Indonesia, where people generally fast during the holy month of Ramadan. And then sometimes the differences can be more sort of legal or regulatory in nature. So, for example, in Taiwan, the legal age of consent to participate in a clinical study is not 18, it's 21. So if we write our protocols and our informed consents on the assumption that an adult is someone of 21 years or older, that can be complex when we try and take the study to Taiwan. All these kind of things are manageable, but they just require awareness and they require a certain adaptability on the part of study sponsors.
You mentioned something, and I just want to diverge to that for a second, and that is the IP boogeyman. How concerned should a sponsor and a CRO as well be in working in Asia in general or in particular regions, as you might see it, where that goes?
This is always a concern. I think most of the countries in Asia, including China, which is where these concerns are often most loudly voiced, all of these countries are signatories to the key international conventions around trade-related intellectual property and so on. So on paper, the mechanisms are there, the protections are there. In practice, the details of regulation, the environment can be more complex, and there can be local nuances in terms of particularly, not so much how patents are defended, but particularly how trademarks, copyright, things like that are defended. And so, as with so many of these things, the secret is having access to local expertise, people who understand the environment in each jurisdiction and who can help to make sure that a sponsor's interests are protected.
So it's a matter of enforcement and having relationships to understand how that's playing out.
Correct, correct. And it's fair to say some of these countries have more demanding intellectual property regimes than many Western countries, but they can be different. And that's not to say that there aren't legitimate concerns, but I think there are now quite well-developed mechanisms to protect those interests.
Talk to me about the talent and staffing situation, if you would. What are the implications for sponsors and CROs?
Mark, I think you could fairly say that nowhere is the war for talent more clearly visible than in the pharmaceutical industry in Asia. We've seen over the last few years with the growth of industry-sponsored clinical research in Asia, an enormous level of competition particularly for people with regional experience in multinational companies. And I suspect that most of my CRO colleagues would say that this is probably the biggest challenge facing their business at the moment, access to talent. At its worst, this can lead to, for example, very high staff turnover. We've seen in some CROs in some countries more than 50% annual turnover of staff, which has an obvious and significant impact on business continuity. And it's also led to things like salary and title inflation in some instances. So, for example, at Takeda, when we interview people for roles, we try to look very carefully beyond their paper job title, because we have found that sometimes a senior director of clinical operations in some companies doesn't have quite the experience and judgment that we would associate with that kind of position in our company. So this is a challenge, but I think the CROs in particular are working hard to manage this, and I think we're seeing a process of catching up. But it certainly does mean, though, that as sponsors we have to be realistic in terms of what we can expect from our CRO partners. Requirements about minimum levels of experience for CRAs, for example, can seem very realistic in a Western context, but can be very, very challenging hurdles for CROs to meet in Asia. So, again, I think we have to sometimes have some flexibility there.
You sound optimistic, though, cautiously. So, yeah.
Absolutely, Mark. I think if working in Asia teaches you one thing, it's the ability of the region to adapt and to catch up. And I think there is an enormous pool of very talented, very well-motivated, very well-trained graduates coming through. And I think we have a number of those individuals in our company and many, many more in others. And I think as those people work their way through the system, as they gain an experience, I think it'll make the talent base in Asia really something quite formidable.
Outstanding. You've touched on this, particularly when you were discussing the diversity of the region. But what can you tell us about the infrastructure and the logistical issues that one faces in Asia? Yeah,
Mark, I think, again, the key word here is probably diversity. So, for example, our team has been doing quite a bit of work recently at Seoul National University Hospital in Korea. And this is a jaw-dropping center, just an amazing academic teaching hospital, absolutely on a par with a leading center anywhere in the world. But equally, we were asked some questions a few months ago by some colleagues in another company about CFR 21 Part 11 compliance. And we had to point out that the country we were talking about not every hospital had glass in the windows. Not every hospital had a reliable electrical power supply. And so in that kind of environment, something like Part 11 compliance can possibly become moot. And for example, even in China, in some of the Tier 2 and Tier 3 cities, internet access is not universal, and so things like electronic data capture can be more problematic than one might expect. What is critical to realize is that the standard of medical care and the standard of scientific research are largely separate from the luxuriousness of the premises, so to speak. So as an example, several years ago I visited a hospital in Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam. And this was a hospital of 2,000 beds, which is a pretty large center by Western standards, not uncommon in Asia. And they had about 3,500 inpatients. And the way they solved this mathematical conundrum was among other things, to top and tail, to have 2 patients to a bed. And for an Australian or for an American, this can be a little hard to contemplate, and it can take a little bit of getting used to. But it was also the case that the surgeon I was meeting there had pretty much the best survival rates for surgical resection of primary liver cancer that I'd ever seen. So it was telling that the standard of medical practice and the appearance of the hospital ward were really sort of somewhat independent.
Yeah, you know, you had mentioned when we spoke earlier that you had received a request for lockable file storage, you know, which really, it doesn't matter really if it's digital or if it's in paper locked away, as long as it's secure, to your point, you know, I think.
Mark, absolutely, and I think, but I think it illustrates how some of the things we assume when we're approaching a trial site in the West in terms of equipment and infrastructure, those assumptions don't necessarily hold in Asia. So, for example, sometimes our investigational product needs to be kept under refrigerated conditions. Not every center will have access to sufficient refrigeration space and a stable power supply to provide that. So we need to be very sensitive to those kind of things when we're considering sites and when we're thinking about starting a study.
Real quickly, what are the 3 most common mistakes, would you say, that sponsors and CROs make in Asia?
I think the first would perhaps be not allowing enough time to get studies started. I think if I could characterize clinical research in the United States, studies are pretty quick to start and then slow to recruit. In Asia, it's largely the other way around. So there's a lot more upfront work and investment of time in getting studies up and running. But once they're up and running, they recruit like tigers. So I think being aware of that in terms of project management and planning is critical. The second thing, I think, is just recognizing that our assumptions about the way in which sites, investigators, and research staff in Asia understand things may be different from the way that they're understood in the West. So things like the importance of informed consent, the reasons for certain safeguards and checks and balances, these kind of things need to be very, very clearly explained up front so that the importance of observing these things is understood. And I think the third and final thing is to show up. It's to visit Asia and to visit sites and to, as we say in the region, show face. Yeah. Asia is very much a culture that's based on personal relationships, based on face-to-face interactions. And so sometimes having somebody from a sponsor company come and visit a site, ask how the project's going, share some information about progress in the rest of the world, that can have a bigger contribution to quality and to recruitment than almost anything else we can do.
Well, James, we could probably, we've just barely scratched the surface here, I know. There is certainly so much to learn and consider moving forward, and it's clearly a very, very dynamic space in the pharmaceutical industry and in the world. But unfortunately, we don't have the time. So on that note, I'm going to conclude this episode. But thank you very much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure.
Terrific perspective. And for our listeners who would like to learn more about the Partnerships in Clinical Trials Conference and Exhibition, which is the producer of this series, please visit us online at www.clinicaltrialpartnerships.com. Until next time, I'm Marc Dresner. Thanks for tuning in.